Right, let's make a start. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us this afternoon on the Belbin webinar, looking at case studies, looking at ways in which people have used Belbin with their individuals, with teams, with organisations. My name is Jo Keeler, and I've been here at Belbin now for, I think it's 19 years. And my goodness, have been able to hear people's experiences. We get really involved in some of the work that we have done to really understand the difference that Belbin can make if used correctly, and we'll be talking about that shortly. With me, I have Deborah McGovern, who has been working, we've been working together for 18 years, I think it's longer than most marriages. Yes. And Deborah, as head of training and consultancy, has been really instrumental in so many projects and so many pieces of work that we have done. And she's here really to share a lot of experiences with you. So we hope we're going to have a real wide-ranging case studies that I'm sure that you will be able to get something from. Before I go any further, we're going to attempt to get this as interactive as possible. And I use the word attempt because we've got quite a few people signed up today. I will try and keep an eye on the Q&A box. So either that or the chat box, whatever you would prefer. And I will try and field your questions as and when. If we don't, I do apologise. Time is the only constraint that we have here. So, one thing I will say is it's been incredibly hard to narrow down the case studies. It's been so difficult to work out which ones will be most useful for you. So what we will do is that we will probably have to do another one of these, Deborah, for all the ones that we couldn't fit in. In fact, we might have to do one every week. That's where it's going at the moment. So what I'd like to do first of all is just share my screen with you, because before we start, it's always good just to get a quick revision about what these team roles are. So without any further ado, what is a Belbin team role? Well, this is quite an important one. It is a tendency to behave, contribute and interact with others in a particular way. Why is this so important? The word tendencies, it's not an absolute, it's not a you will always, you will tend to behave in a certain way. These are the 9 team roles here. We have 9 different clusters of behaviours that, in fact, all of us are a whole mixture of all 9 here. But what we find is that we have strengths in about 2 or 3, another 2 or 3 we're okay with, and the others we really should delegate. But this is what a Belbin team role is. So they're measuring, the other key word on that last slide was behave. We're measuring behaviour. So we're measuring what people do, not, this is quite critical, not who they are. So of course who they are, their personality links and informs our behaviour, but my goodness, so does so many other things, our experiences, our values, our motivations. There's external factors like working from home. That's quite a big thing at the moment, which is changing our behaviour. And also as we learn the language of Belbin, we are able to adapt our behaviour to be able to get the most from our contributions. So remember that with Belbin, right at the very beginning, it's not saying you are A, it's saying this is the way that at the moment you are behaving, the things that you do. So what does make an effective team? Well, we know that we need all of these 9 team roles in a team, but do you know, if it was as easy as that, I wouldn't be sitting here, to be perfectly honest with you. What we need to have is a representation of all those 9 team roles, but most crucially, everybody within that team needs to understand their contribution. They need to understand their strengths and their weaknesses, and not just their strengths and weaknesses, but those of everybody within the team. And the team also needs to exploit these relationships between individual team members to try and make it as effective as it can. Now, one could say, oh, that's fine, we'll just chat, we'll talk about Belbin and it's the job done. Well, over the next few minutes, what we're going to do is explain why it's not just as simple as that and why we really need to work on this on a regular basis. I'm just whizzing through these slides now because...
Jo, just first of all, I know that someone has said it's difficult to hear with an echo, but there is just something not quite right with the microphone.
Okay, what shall I unplug it and see what happens? Thanks for that, Deborah. Is it any better now? No? Hello?
No, I think that's worse.
Okay. Okay, is that that okay?
That sounds a bit better to me.
A bit better. Okay, apologies for that. It was fine earlier. Don't you just love these?
Yes, I know.
Oh, technology and gremlins. I do apologise. Okay. So basically what we need to know is that simply putting together a number of people and expecting them to work as a team is not enough. What we need to do is we need to work at it, and it's difficult. The other thing with Belbin as well is that it's not just about how you see yourself, because we then remain in an echo chamber. We have an echo chamber of saying, this is how I am, yes it is, isn't it? And so on and so forth. We don't grow and we don't learn. So the key thing about Belbin also, and we'll talk about this in detail with our case studies, it's very important to get feedback from others. Feedback from people who can actually, you know, that they can see and they interact with your behaviour. They're the ones that see you at work on a regular basis. So we will be talking about observer assessments. Deborah, how's the sound now? Is it any better?
It's not great. It's not as good as it is usually. There's something about with the microphone. Is it in a different place? Because usually it's very clear.
Do you know the whole thing's in a different place, and do you know why that is? Meredith Belbin came in last week and completely Zoom bombed me, and all of my settings just went. It's not good. Should I leave it further away or closer?
Speak again.
Closer?
I think that's better. I think that sounds a bit better.
So I really need to go full Brittany. Okay, fantastic. Right, so there we have the observer assessments. So what can Belbin do? It can help you as an individual. It's for you, for your self-development, your learning and your self-awareness. To learn where and when you can make your best contributions, to understand how others see you, and to learn how to be a strong example. So really manage to strengthen your strength and manage your weaknesses. Well, how do you do that? Well, the first stop is looking at your Belbin reports. And we're going to go over this because Deborah will be talking about Belbin reports quite a lot when she's going through her case studies. So it's really important that we see them. So to find out your Belbin team roles, you need to fill in the Belbin self-perception inventory. And this is all done online. If any of you have been Belbined and it's been something you've added up yourself, the paper and pen, that really isn't Belbin. That would be a version that isn't us. So the only official version of Belbin is something that you would have online, because it has all of the research behind it. It's not saying you are A, it's giving you advice as well. So these are the reports, and this is Sam T, very briefly showing how they fit with each of those team roles, which percentile they're falling into. We can also find out how other people see Sam T's behaviour. Are they seeing the same amounts of those team roles, or are there differences? What is it that Sam can't see in him or herself? We can also see what words people have used to describe Sam, because Sam has asked people to fill in observer assessments. And these are just lists of words which you have to tick if you think they apply to Sam. And you can see what words they are using and whether or not the words they're using are describing the strengths of each of the team roles, or are they looking at the allowable weaknesses? Because that's one of the key things with Belbin. Each of these team roles has a strength, but an allowable weakness too. And you can also see what sort of work is best suited for Sam in this situation. This is just a few of the pages from the individual report. So once the individuals have got this, you can put that data together and you find that you have all of this data can produce a team report where you can understand the gaps and the overlaps in the team. You can work out who should be making what contribution and when they should make them. That's quite a crucial thing, actually. You can find out what you're missing. Do you need somebody else to join the team? It could just be temporary, or can somebody else play that role instead? What do you have too much of? How are you going to manage this? Do you have a shockery of shapers which is going to cause hell? Or are you cloning as a team, a department, or an organisation? Do you only want people around you who are like you or who are similar to everybody else? Do you perhaps don't want to rock the boat? So again, we produce the team reports here. They give you an overview of where those gaps and overlaps are. Looking at the averages for the team, looking at those really strong examples and giving you an idea of the culture of the team and what words collectively were used for that team. So I've just done probably one of the quickest overviews of Belbin and the reports ever. No, the history of man. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to pass over to Deborah. I might do a few things in the background to try and get my sound right. But Deborah, you've been working on, I think, all continents over the last 18 years. Please start. Who would you like to use as your first case study?
Well, I thought what I'd try and do is talk about really very different sorts of organisation to give an idea. So I thought I'd start off with an international company in environmental services. And it's been fascinating because this has gone on over many years now, and it started with an accreditation, which is that a group of people in HR who wanted to become accredited in the use of Belbin so that they could generate the reports that Joe has just shown you, and actually buy their own system, our report generating system. Out of that, they invited me to go and work with the HR leadership team that was for UK and Ireland. And what we did there was looked at the people in the leadership team, and it was actually almost a group. It was quite big, and they knew that what they wanted to do was some reorganization to make it a smaller grouping. So looking at the issues there, but also what was the key purpose? What was it that they wanted this senior, the leadership HR team to be? How did they want to be seen in the rest of the organization? And by being able to look really closely at themselves and whether that matched up with what it was they were wanting to portray was really useful. Also, often happens that you find that people come into a team because, yes, that's someone who's really just like someone else there. They're going to work well with us. They'll be part of the team. And Joe's alluded to this, but it really becomes clear that you then have clusters of different types of behavior. And it's what you do about that. Now, in many cases, it's because people think they should be like that, because that's how the other people are and that's how the director is and so on. So there's almost a wanting to behave and wanting to be that way. So this was a really honest opening up, looking at what was there. And then as a result of that, I was invited along to their conference for all of the HR people. So we've got really vast numbers of people in actually a relatively small space. And the good thing there was that it took it to another phase, and it gave people the ability to all understand, within HR, all understand this, apart from the fact it was really good fun, having some fantastic exercises and people running around this big room, and but not big enough room. And so Belbin could be used in all sorts of ways. And with one particular client we're talking about here, with lots of different aspects. I'm not going to tell you all about everything there because it would take forever, but suffice to say that we still are working with them, and they have internal learning sets. So they actually use this. They have their own version of our system, so they can use it to set together a team. How would it look if someone came out of that team? Go back in. So they're able to use that, and they have these learning sets, and then we mentor them. So that's a kind of overview of one of our clients. And when people say, what about measuring? How can you measure this? A lot of it comes down to, it has been so effective that they have therefore asked us to come back, that they use this integrated within the organization. And that's been the case, as I say, for many years now.
Thank you, Deborah. I think that's fantastic. So what you're doing there is with the senior team, you were looking at diversity in terms of Belbin Team Role behaviour, and they were cloning. And they were cloning in terms of the behaviour, and that's not always obvious, is it? And I find that really interesting. And then to have these internal learning sets is so crucial, because what we hear very often is, well, I've done Belbin, now what?
Yeah.
don't we? And you think, well, it's not about that. What to get the most from Belbin is what you're doing in the first instance is you are introducing people to a language. And then what you're then doing is helping them implement and use that language on a daily, regular basis that allows them to become more effective themselves. So they're almost beginning to start to use that language to, in a way, sort of self-coach the team. You said there actually one of the measures was the fact that they had these learning sets and we were going back. I'm a little bit cynical, Deborah. I don't know if you know that.
Well, have I noticed that?
I don't know if you've noticed it, but sometimes I do worry when people say, well, we did this, where they came in, they did a 2-hour session and we increased productivity by 39,000% or whatever the words are. I mean, I exaggerate. It's really hard to measure. Sometimes just by the fact that somebody is there and realises that the team needs to be worked with and is starting to take a proactive approach, that alone can make a real difference. The fact that people have all met up once and actually been able to chat and talk, that's going to increase sometimes some of the psychological safety, which potentially could help the team as well. And you don't know how the team were to start with, you don't know what their baseline was. So it's difficult coming up, I think, with figures and percentages and increase this, increase that. I really do think that it's going back and then implementing work and continuing to implement it shows that it's working. It shows the effect that it's having. Mm-hmm. So you've just gone internet. Sorry, Deborah, would you agree?
Oh, what do you want me to say? No.
I don't know.
I shall go. I'm going to say something now. I'll go and wash my mouth out afterwards. But actually, I think if all people do is something to say, oh, I came up as a shaper implementer, I came up as a completer finisher specialist. I really think, well, please don't even, what is the point of that?
Absolutely.
There is absolutely no point unless it's integrated into the work, into the way that someone is using that either for themselves, for development, or is using it for the team to become really more effective and to therefore have an impact. So it's sort of individual, the team, and then the organisation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Otherwise,
actually.
A waste of time.
Isn't it just? It is a waste of time. We don't have much of that at the moment. Right, we don't have much time for this webinar, so we'll crack on. So Deborah just talked about a large environmental services company. What I'd like to talk to you now about is a small startup. And last year I was invited to work with a company called Oppo, and they're the healthy ice cream people, not the mobile phones. They started up about 2 years ago, and their dream, their vision is to get ice cream to the public, which actually is, it's not going to be that harming on your waistline, basically. It's a low calorie option. And they came to us because they'd got to a point and they thought, right, there's so many, 16 of them. What do we do now? What is it that we need to do to take our sales, our company to the next level? So we spent a day with them after everybody had collected their Belbin with their observers and came with their reports. And we tried to get them to really understand the impact of each and every individual into their organisation and the role that they were playing. And then what we found out is where were the gaps within the organisation, and did it matter? Because of course sometimes, Deborah, I think you'd agree here, we say, oh, there's a gap there. Perhaps they don't have a high amount of, I don't know, in this case, perhaps shaper resource investigator. But before you fill that gap, you need to have the conversation from a business point of view. Do you need it? Do you need that behaviour in the first place?
Yes.
Absolutely. Is it critical right now that you need it? So we're able to have these conversations. And what happened is actually informed their future recruitment policy, because they realised they didn't have enough of a particular type of team role. So they were trying to ensure that those people who weren't, they wanted to get far more sort of outward looking, far more shaper resource investigator people within the organisation. It's also allowed the two owners of the organisation to really see where they should be allocating work. And I think this is an interesting one when it comes to a startup, is that everybody sort of mucks in, don't they? Everybody mucks in and does what needs to be done. And this has sort of just grown organically, as these things do. But by using Belbin, they were able to think, well, hang on a second. This actually requires this kind of behaviour. So who has that? That was an eye-opener in itself. And they were able to allocate the right people with the right roles. Now, going back to this ongoing aspect, is I went back only about, I think it was about 6 weeks ago. We had to do it all via Zoom, which is a shame because I didn't get to have any of their ice cream. I was a bit unhappy about that, but never mind, I know. And what they had done is they had rejigged things. They had said, right, okay, now we need to do this and what have you. They have the team roles all around the offices to make sure that they are making the right contribution. They're very conscious, right here we need a coordinator, we need a what have you. So they're starting to really use the language of Belbin. And this is useful. This is just one, this is all on our website actually. You can download and record and view a video of this particular case study on our website. But it made me think that actually back in 2015, and I just went and printed out the article, we worked very much with a government initiative which was called the Growth Accelerator Programme. Deborah, you were really involved in this. And it was a case of the UK at the time wanted to invest in its SMEs, its small, medium enterprises, because obviously that's where the health of the country is really, in these SMEs. And the government were putting funding towards organisations to help them perform better. I think that in a nutshell is what it is. So we've worked with a lot of SMEs in this case, and I'll have a link to the paper with all the data on it when I send everybody the recording afterwards. But what they found are these are small companies about to take the next step. One organisation, they actually reported an increase in turnover of 66% 1 year after the programme. It's not all to do with Belbin, I'm sure there are other factors as well. But what they said Belbin really did was gave them a very clear understanding of what makes them tick and how we best perform in certain areas. It helped us acknowledge, that was a good word, acknowledge when we're not good in certain areas and to understand why and how to deal with it. And that's because you're using this language of Belbin, which isn't personal. You're able to use it to be able to talk about strengths and weaknesses. Another organisation said it was good to help them through some staffing issues and to have a common language for growing the business, identifying gaps within their team, and has helped us to recruit staff more effectively. And I think this is it, isn't it? It's very much giving you that heads up space. We need to get to this next place. Let's look at our behaviour as an organisation. Let's use the language of Belbin to be able to inform our next steps. Deborah, you're keeping very quiet. This is lovely.
I am, aren't I? No, I was looking at the time, so I thought I won't interrupt. I'm going to let you say a few words about that. And but I thought I would then talk in a minute about a sort of SME.
No, and that's interesting. I think that would be really interesting. Now, all of this information so far is going to be available. I will send it to you when we send the link to the recording after, so you don't have to take lots of notes. It's all there, don't worry. So this is talking about it in the UK. Deborah, I know you have some amazing work trips, whizzing here, there and everywhere with their suitcase. Now that's been curtailed a little bit recently, hasn't it? Hasn't it just? Would you like to give us an example of one of your amazing trips?
Actually, before I do, I just wanted to say that, in fact, the case studies that we're talking about today are very much in the commercial companies that we're talking about. We actually do a lot with public sector, with hospitals, universities and so on, and also with charities. But we actually thought that for today we were focusing mostly on the private sector. So just wanted to contextualize that. So this one I wanted to talk about was actually in Lebanon, and most wonderful country. The organisation is in logistics and the management of a large facility, so lots of really, really key health and safety issues. This was driven by the chief exec, who had been educated partly in the UK. He's Lebanese, but educated here, and he'd come across Belbin, but didn't know a lot about it, but just thought that that might be something that would help the organisation. So his first step was to ask for reports to be completed. And he actually got his HR director to get reports. So essentially just bought reports and looked at those. And then she said, I realized I needed more understanding of that and thought that it would carry weight to have the external people who are responsible for this, so Belbin, to come in and work with us. So it was with the senior management team initially that it was, you know, what are they doing? What's the purpose? And so that was about looking at them as a team and giving individual feedback. The CEO thought that it was so effective and he could see a difference in the way that people were managing that he wanted to then cascade that down to a group of about 35 managers at the next level. Now, the thing is there that culturally, the expectation was that they would take orders from above. And so, I mean, some very bright, very able people, but the CEO was trying to change the culture to get people to take more responsibility, be willing to take some risks and sort of put their head on the line in a way, while still, of course, working within this tightly controlled aspect of health and safety. And so there we looked very, well, first of all, individually. So each of these managers completed their reports and had individual feedback before then having everyone together for a team session. But a team session like no other, because usually what we're trying to do is dig really deeply into, you know, how people relate and what's going on. This, I mean, it was wonderful that they were all together, but the idea that Belbin was there, the word got around, and all sorts of cousins and friends and people were invited as well. So what was going to be something for 35 people, I actually ended up having about 65 people there. So it was a different dynamic. Having said that, what we got out of that was really having people had development sheets, really. So I'm saying sheets, they actually had little sort of booklets. So they had development and they went through things in stages, and then they were then working differently with the people who reported to them. So it was about, as I say, that sort of cascading, but it's a continuous thing because they use it in recruitment. They certainly have it as a way of understanding who should work with whom and why certain issues were arising. And in fact, I work with the chief exec to be, you know, he's looking at different ways of doing things. There have been, as you can imagine, major political as well as more recent changes. And it's how they can, he's looking to have this agile working around the organization, a lot more flexibility. And so I work on coaching program with him, and also it's broader, it's looking at next steps that he can take, but it's using Belbin. It's wonderful. He's really integrated that into the company.
So that was a way, Deborah, where they started with the individual very much so and spent time. So the individual really understood their strengths, their weaknesses. They had the language of Belbin was familiar to them, and then they put them together.
And they put them together
as the team. But it was starting at that point with the individual then going on to the team.
Indeed.
Well, that's fantastic. And did you find that many people, because with Belbin, obviously you have the situation where sometimes how other people see you is very different to how you see yourself. Wow. Were there any, you know, when you're working generally, it doesn't have to be this example, is when you're doing sort of one-to-one coaching with people, does that tend to take up quite a large chunk of your discussions?
It certainly can do. It certainly can do. And sometimes where there are big differences, you can tell within some organizations or some individuals in organizations, it's, yeah, okay, well, I was expecting that and that's fine. Other people can be quite hit by it. You know, they've got me wrong. I'm not like that. So it is about getting people to understand, why do you think other people have seen you differently in that case? Is it that you are doing something unintentionally? But if that's the case, it's about knowledge and helping you to increase your self-awareness of how you're behaving. But also, if you don't like the idea of that, and if you've had, in some cases, some negative things or quite a few negative things said about you, let's say, you don't know who said that, but that's feedback that you're getting. So it's, what can you do about that? Is it about being able, and a lot of the time it's this sitting down with other people in that team and saying, I'm really surprised. I don't mean to be like this. I'm surprised that you see me like that. Or do you realize, I think I've got a lot more of this side that I can show, and because of the work I'm doing at the moment, I'm not getting a chance to express that. So it's all of these things. I kind of feel, actually, Jo, I'm just touching on the surface of that. There's such a lot to be said about that, but that's just to give a bit of a flavour, but perhaps something else that we can concentrate on yet another webinar.
And do you know, I think that is quite crucial though, because it's not a one-off. Because we're not saying you are A, we're saying this is how you're behaving. And one of our distributors, actually the one in the US, this is one of his case studies, I suppose. It's not really a case, it's just how he uses it. Is he talks about very much like the cholesterol test. Other people may have heard him say about this before on previous webinars. It's what you have as a snapshot as somebody is at that particular moment in time. And when we're coaching and understanding how you're coming across to others, where you want to strengthen your strengths or minimize your weaknesses, etc., etc. What you can then do, because we're behavioural based, is go back and check to see whether or not the things that you've been doing and your awareness and everything else has made a change. So you've had your cholesterol check, you've done a bit of exercise, you've had your Benacol and everything else, and you go back to the doctor to see if any changes have been made. And that's very much with the Belbin and the ongoing process, isn't it? It's not a one-off, it's something that has to be seen. I know somebody here in the chat has very much said, so I started with action-orientated roles. I've now perhaps gone more over to people. Is that okay? And you think, well, yes, because our behaviour changes. You wouldn't expect your top roles to suddenly become your bottom and vice versa. But as we go through life and as we find out what other people are valuing and all of these things, and more importantly, what work actually needs to be done, we can find that our behaviour will change, and it constantly sort of ebbs and flows, I suppose you'd say, Deborah. Yeah.
I also think that's the whole reason that it's so useful in development, that there's not something static about this, that we can look at how do we want to be and what do we need to be in particular work and at particular times. A lot of times it's relative. You know, it might be that when I'm working with someone, and let's take Jo. When I'm working with Jo, then she has got even more resource investigator than me, so that enthusiasm comes over, and I find myself taking much more that, okay, from the specialist perspective, let's look at professional standards here, or questioning things.
What are you trying to say, Deborah?
Yeah, and it drives her mad. But when I'm with someone else, I might be the one who seems like the sort of I always call it the Tigger in Winnie the Pooh terms, you know, who's kind of bouncing around. But that's important to understand as well, that it's relative to other people the way that we come over.
Yeah, that's perfect. So there we have Deborah's wonderful example of work she did with a company in Lebanon whilst we were all just in the office.
Well, Jo, come on, from New Zealand, weren't you? You did some things there, was that?
God, no, we did not. If we rehearsed this at all, is it? No, absolutely. We have. I've been over. I'm in a very fortunate position. Is being a partner here at Belbin, is that people very often want to sit me down and tell me how they've been using Belbin and the successes that they have had. So I'm like in the middle of a spoked wheel with all of these things that people tell me about things. They're not my case studies. But there are ways in which people want to show how excited they are that they've found this language that is really beginning to help them. And I was over in New Zealand in 2012. In fact, it was exactly 8 years ago this week. Not that it came up on my Facebook stories or anything, and I had a silent Because we were launching the latest version of the Belbin reports. We were launching our 7th version because Belbin has not stood still. It is very different to how it was. Well, not very different, actually. Fundamentally, it's exactly the same, but the reports and the analysis and the data and the research and everything behind it is updated on a regular basis. We're just working on our 8th version at the moment. And I was sat in a wonderful conference room and I was being told by a telecommunications company about how they were using Belbin. And it was all really, really interesting. And then they said something and I suddenly sort of like, sorry, could you repeat that please? And they had actually said that they had reduced the amount of time spent in meetings by 50%. Now, I don't know about you, but 50% less time in meetings would be amazing. So what were they doing? I have to use a flip chart. I can't not use a flip chart, excuse me a second. Is that they had one of these in every single one of their meeting rooms. So they had a circle, and I'm doing this live, so it's going to look terrible, and I probably can't see it, it's in orange, didn't think that one through. They had a team circle. Let me just go around that again, just to make it look really awful. And what they did, they have a team role in each of these. So they have the shaper, they have the implementer, the completer, finisher. These were all of the action roles. Then in these sections, they would have the, let's go coordinator, let's go for team worker, let's go for resource investigator, which are all of those social and people roles. And down here, they would then have the plant, the monitor evaluator, and the specialist. Now, everybody had their Belbin reports with them. And as they entered the meeting rooms, what they would do is they'd all write their names on their top 2 or 3 team roles. So if it was myself and Deborah, let's be honest here, I would be here, here, here. Oh, Deborah, you would be here. Sorry. You'd be here. But you'd also be here. So we're cloning really, aren't we? This is terrible. But then we'd ask Jill to come into the meeting as well, so we'd be fine. Absolutely. So Jill comes in here and here. And so what they'd do is before every meeting, they'd say, right, this is the makeup of everybody in this room. What do we need to be aware of? What do we need to consciously be checking to ensure that there's not just loads and loads of ideas, lots of chatting going on? What do we need to ensure to make sure there isn't just delegation going on and nobody actually doing any work? What do we need to make sure to, oh, we haven't got anybody there. We need to remember to not make a decision right now, but to wait until we can find somebody with strong monitor evaluator. And by having that right at the very beginning of every meeting, they were able to sometimes make adjustments in their behaviour to ensure that it wasn't just this. That perhaps somebody would say, I need to play the implementer role. I will make sure that we are organised and we get through. So by doing that, they were able to just spend far, far less time in the meetings. Thumbs up from me. And I said, it's so simple, isn't it? It's so simple. Deborah, sorry.
No, sorry, I was cutting in, but just to say that one of the case studies I was going to mention, but in fact I'm going to truncate because I'm keeping an eye on the time, but was in fact a company, it was a small company, family-owned business, had been there for a few generations, so very different. And but it made me think of that because that's exactly what they decided to do, was to have around the whole premises really, but where they had their meetings, they would have these circles of team role circles, and also just a one-page definition of each of the roles. And that really helped people because this was, I learned new language here, it was in fact retail, small retail business, and so they had clicks and bricks, which means that it was online, but they also had some shops as well.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, they just get
I've learned something, thank you.
But these were people, so driven by the MD here, who was the owner, what they were wanting to do was have everyone go through Belbin to be able to understand one another more and to understand why some people were driving one another crazy. I'm going to put it quite politely. And that meant that there were people who had never ever come across any kind of behavioral assessments or even psychometric assessments or anything. So they were very fearful, and it was a very different sort of exercise there. But eventually we got to the stage where with those individuals having that, you just heard it. Even in the warehouse, they were actually doing things like, oh, someone hasn't been doing enough completer finishing here, just look at this. And it was really warming to the heart, because they were using it in a very practical way. And it was not in an intellectual way. It was actually, how is this making us work really much more efficiently? Now, I was going to go on to talk a bit more about them, because in fact we did work with their mission, vision, values.
I remember this. I remember you coming back, really.
Yes,
yeah.
I was really excited, because spending the weekend with them on that and looking at some things with values. But I think I would like to, at another point, talk about maybe using this more deeply with values. But I would just say, use the team reports, use the words that come out of that, the pattern that comes out of that, of what have you got most of and least of, but particularly the combination of all of the individuals in the team, the words that have been put together, and how does that stack up against your culture and your values. So I think that's quite important. And hardly without taking a breath, so Joe can't get in, I'm going to go straight on to something else, which I just wanted to share, because I feel really strongly about this. It's projects, and I know so often people are working with project teams, and this was a biopharma company. I won't give you the whole background. I will actually just say we were looking at how they could run their projects more effectively. And we had a day where they'd hired some rooms to use, and you know that lovely whiteboard stuff that you can just sort of stick up on and it sticks on the wall?
Oh yes, I love that.
Essentially, what we did was he turned this room into whiteboards all the way around the room, and then they looked at each of the projects. So we had a different project, major project, on each wall. And so people were physically standing up and doing this, so there was a real engagement in that way. But the content being looking at what is the project, and let's take which stages of that project we're working on, and then for that, what are the timescales, what are the skills needed, and this was the bit that previously had been missed out because they'd done that bit for themselves, but what behaviors, what sort of approach do you need, and then which people. And so therefore, once we'd got that on each of these project areas, looking at, were some people being called upon again and again and again because their behaviors were high. But what we were able to help them with was to see where therefore they perhaps did need to either develop or get some additional people with those behaviors. But more productively, they were able to see that where someone was on a project and tended to stay there, it made more sense at a given time point for them to go over, I'm going like this because it was on the other wall, but for them to move on to the other project. So they had these concurrent projects, and they said that they believe that their not just efficiency, but the productivity increased because they had people playing to their behavioral strengths as well as the knowledge base that they had. And you know, you get greater engagement when you do. So that's a very truncated version.
No, but can you just go through that again? So I've got a really squeaky chair, I do apologise. So it was a project, and you broke the projects down into small chunks.
It's sort of like a stage of a project.
Okay.
Or you could call it a project stage, or you could call it an objective stage of project. And then you itemize at that stage of the project, what are the different items, what are the different tasks or items that need to be covered.
Yes.
And you list all of those. That's why it's great to have it on the wall, because you can have them all listed there. And then you look at what the skills are and the timescales are, of course. But then what brings it into Belbin is what, given those skills, what are the behaviours that are needed? And if people aren't as familiar with team roles as we are, then they can just talk generally about the behaviours. And then from that, we can say, well, that sounds like a plant, or that sounds like a resource investigator, whatever. And then looking at people's reports and what they have as their high, but also some things they could maybe build upon, which were those behaviours that people had, and therefore which people could you allocate.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great, and I'm just visualising that now. Actually, if you had that for each of those stages of the project all around the room, I should imagine it's quite powerful. If you think, well, hang on a minute, Pete's name's over there, it's over there. Oh, he's over here. Yeah. Actually, he's over, and then there's some real good questions that you could ask. Right. Is Pete the person who's the bottleneck because he's involved in too much? Yep. Is there somebody else other than that person who could perhaps do that work?
Can we develop? Can we? Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing that, Deborah.
But we could do a whole session on projects.
No, that's fine. I'm writing this down now. Any ideas for future webinars, project teams? I've written that down, otherwise I will forget, because that is what I tend to do. Okay, so we've gone through quite a few different ways in which Belbin can be used there, very much starting with the individual, looking at the team and looking at the organisation. There's a whole range of more case studies, etc., that you can find on our website. And again, I will give everybody a link to those so that you can look in more detail. We've also got, I mean, Deborah said, you know, we've just stayed on some of the sort of the larger sort of commercial companies as well today, but we do also have a whole area on our website about how universities and higher education is using Belbin. Again, that's going to be another webinar, but I'm currently working with the University of Warwick, and they are putting all of their stuff online, and so they want to start forming those teams of students who aren't meeting face to face, and they actually need to put them into balanced teams before they start their executive education. So I'm working with them at the moment doing that, and that's quite exciting, having the luxury of actually choosing these teams and making them as balanced as they possibly can after they've completed their Belbin self-perception and got observers. So there are so many different ways in which you can use Belbin, so many different ways. So let's just recap. Belbin is about behaviour. Belbin is a measure of what you do, not who you are. It is influenced by many different things, and so can change. There's no such thing really as guessing your Belbin or just doing something on a paper and pen. To find out the Belbin team roles that you have preferences for, you have to complete the self-perception inventory, and the reports will generate a report that will give you, the software and everything will give you a report which will give you advice on how to play those roles to better effect. But that's only half the story. What you also need to do is find out how others see you. And this is really, we've had a question up actually, Deborah, saying, what happens when you have such a difference between how other people see you and how you see yourself? Well, that's a really, that can be a really long conversation, but it's asking questions, isn't it? Like, well, who did you ask to observe you? In what context do they work with you? Perhaps what do you think their team roles may be? Where are they coming from? Where's their state of reference? What's the seniority of somebody your manager? Do you manage them? All of these different things are questions that you need to ask in that situation. And once you have all this wonderful data in, you have these reports that really are the starting point for individuals and teams to becoming far more effective. Be it an international team where you've got, you know, you're starting on the top level with the chief execs and the board, or whether we're just looking at us normal people in organisations working with one another, Belbin really can help. But just to reiterate, it's not a one-stop shop. It isn't we ran a Belbin session, this happened, everything worked brilliantly. What a Belbin session does and what the reports do in that very first instance is they give everybody an understanding. They give everybody a language to be able to discuss this, and they are able to help people work better together, but which has to be implemented on an ongoing basis. Deborah, is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap up, or if anybody's got any questions?
I'm conscious of the time, so I'll leave you to say with the questions and things.
Okay, let me just click in there. Okay. Oh, here we go. Have you any case studies of Belbin being used in outplacement? and how would you recommend applying it in that setting? Thank you very much for that. So the answer is yes. Yeah, but I think when you're using it for outplacement, it's just one of many tools that you use. We would never say just to use Belbin in this situation. It's a number of tools that you can use for that. Deborah, you've done some, had some experience with outplacement, yes, haven't you?
And both recruitment, so the coming in and the outplacement as well. And yeah, I would say, just broadly speaking, because having your Belbin profile, your Belbin report, can help you to really consciously think about how do I think I behave? How do these particular people I've been working with see me? And what is it that I think I can either develop more of, or be a fantastic example of type, rather than just be, oh, I'll try and be a bit of everything. And that can help very much with you thinking longer term about what you want to do and how you should go about things.
No, fantastic, thank you. I know that it's all the touch points, isn't it? It's where that person is going to be touching other people within the organisation. So within a team, what's the effect of that person joining that team? What's the effect of who's managing them? The relationships within everybody. Belbin just can help you understand where the strengths and the weaknesses may be at every point.
So I just wanted to say, because although they're called team roles, and I think that's pertinent in relation to the outplacement, team roles, so it is how we are in relation to other people, but actually it very much can be for personal development, whether that is thinking, what is my life going to be about from now on, and what should I be looking at, and
yes,
so on. But it's very much the individual as well as the team. Just felt the need to say that because sometimes, because of the name team roles, when we talk about teams, of course a lot of it is about how people interact, but sometimes a team is two people, so it can be fantastically useful to have a greater understanding of myself from going for interviews or whatever, you know. It's talking to anyone, improving communication, really.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. I think I misread the question to start with, but Deborah, thank you very much. I think outplacement is perhaps, it's a key. It's very much, isn't it? Right. Thank you so much. We've got some great, great comments there in the chat. Thank you very much indeed. I would love to be able to ask you right now, and I feel that I can, that if you have any suggestions for further webinars, we want to try and keep them short because everybody's got, lots that they need to be doing, and we'd like to have quite an informal style because we've got so much experience here at Belbin that we can draw on. So if you've got anything, please just drop a line to team@belbin.com. We'll be delighted to hear from you. But thank you so much for your time, and we hope you found it useful. And remember, nobody's perfect, but a team can be. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.